The rain didn't just fall. It battered the pavement of Chicago's Gold Coast like broken glass. Eleanor stood on the porch of the multi-million-dollar townhouse she had helped finance, shivering violently in a soaked emerald evening gown. Behind the heavy mahogany door, the man she was supposed to marry laughed with his affluent guests, having locked her out like a stray dog. But Arthur made one fatal mistake that night. He forgot who owned the estate to cross the street. And from the shadows of a sleek, idling town car, the city's most feared man was watching her every move. The evening had started with a suffocating tension that Penelope Hayes was all too familiar with. The grand dining room of the Pendleton estate was bathed in the warm golden glow of crystal chandeliers, a stark contrast to the coldness radiating from the man sitting at the head of the table. Arthur Pendleton, her fiancé of 2 years, was a prominent financial advisor who cared more about his curated public image than anything else in the world. Penelope, or Penny, as her late father used to call her, was a brilliant corporate strategist. She was also a plus-size woman, a fact that Arthur treated not as a physical reality, but as a personal insult to his ego. Penny sat quietly, her soft plush curves wrapped in a custom-tailored emerald silk gown. She had spent hours getting ready, hoping to make Arthur proud in front of his elite clients. Across from her sat Councilman Richard Caldwell and his excessively thin wife, Victoria. The conversation was dry, filled with the boastful arrogance of men who thought they owned the world. Penny tried to remain invisible, picking at her roasted pheasant, acutely aware of Arthur's piercing, critical gaze snapping toward her every time she lifted her fork. The breaking point arrived during dessert. Victoria Caldwell, swirling her third glass of Bordeaux, looked at Penny with a thinly veiled smirk. "Tell me, Penelope, Arthur mentioned you were trying out that new boutique fitness center in River North. It must be so exhausting carrying around all that extra stress." The table went dead silent. Penny's cheeks flushed a deep, humiliating crimson. She waited for Arthur to say something, to defend her, to change the subject. Instead, Arthur let out a tight, embarrassed chuckle. "Penny struggles with discipline, Victoria. We're working on it. I tell her all the time a man needs a wife who reflects his success, not his indulgences." A cold knot formed in Penny's stomach. The sheer cruelty of the statement, delivered with a charming smile, broke something fundamental inside her. She didn't shout. She didn't throw her wine. She simply stood up, the emerald silk rustling against the heavy mahogany chair. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice trembling, and walked out of the dining room. Arthur caught up with her in this grand foyer. His fingers clamped around her upper arm like a vice, dragging her toward the heavy front door. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his charming facade dropping to reveal the vicious narcissist underneath. "I'm leaving, Arthur. I won't sit there and let you humiliate me." Penny shot back, trying to pry his fingers off her bruised skin. "Humiliate you? You humiliate yourself." Arthur snarled, his face inches from hers. "Look at you, Penelope. Do you think a man like Caldwell wants to do business with someone whose fiancé looks like she has zero self-control? I tolerate your weight because your trust fund helped buy this house, but do not push me." Tears pricked Penny's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "We're done, Arthur," The wedding is off. Arthur's eyes went dark. The storm outside had been brewing all evening, and a massive crack of thunder rattled the stained glass transom above them. You think you can walk away from me. You're nothing without me. Who else is going to love a fat, pathetic mess like you? Before Penny could process the venom in his words, Arthur shoved her hard. She stumbled backward, her bare shoulders hitting the freezing, damp air as she tripped over the threshold. The torrential rain instantly assaulted her. She gasped, spinning around just in time to see Arthur sneering at her from the warmth of the foyer. Cool off, Penelope. Maybe skipping a meal in the cold will do you some good. He spat. Click. The heavy deadbolt slid into place. Penny stood paralyzed on the limestone porch. The temperature had plummeted to near freezing. An unseasonable autumn storm tearing through Chicago. The wind howled, driving the icy rain sideways. Within seconds, her beautiful emerald gown was plastered to her heavy curves, the silk offering absolutely no protection against the biting cold. Her heels offered no stability on the slick stone. She hammered her fists against the thick oak door. "Arthur, open the door!" she screamed, her voice instantly swallowed by the roar of the thunder. My purse is inside. My phone. Arthur, please. She waited, her breath coming out in white, ragged clouds. Nothing. She moved to the front window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. She could see Arthur walking back into the dining room, smoothing his tailored suit jacket, laughing as he poured Councilman Caldwell another glass of scotch. He had left her out here to freeze. He knew she had no coat, no keys, no phone, and no money. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. The streets of the Gold Coast were deserted. The opulent houses sat behind high iron gates, their residents completely insulated from the storm and the despair on Arthur Pendleton's porch. Penny wrapped her arms around her shivering body, her teeth chattering violently. She huddled against the brick wall, trying to find an ounce of shelter from the relentless downpour, feeling utterly worthless, abandoned, and entirely alone. But she wasn't alone. Directly across the rain-slicked street, half hidden in the shadows of a sprawling Gothic-style estate, sat a matte black Maybach. The engine purred so quietly, it was barely audible over the storm. Inside the heavily tinted vehicle, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and dark espresso. Domenico Russo sat in the back seat, his jaw clenched, his dark, dangerous eyes fixed on Arthur Pendleton's front porch. Dom was not a man who played by polite society's rules. As the undisputed head of the Chicago syndicate, his name struck terror into the hearts of corrupt politicians and rival families alike. He was a man composed of cold calculation and lethal precision. Tonight, he was parked on this street for one reason. Arthur Pendleton. The arrogant financial advisor had been laundering money for the Russo family, and recently the ledgers had started coming up short. Dom had come to deliver a final, fatal warning. But for the last 10 minutes, the Mafia boss's attention had been entirely derailed by the scene unfolding on the porch. "Boss?" His driver, a massive enforcer named Leo, murmured from the front seat, peering through the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. "Pendleton just locked a woman outside in this weather." Dom didn't answer. His gaze was locked on the woman in the green dress. Even through the torrential rain, he could see the violent shaking of her shoulders. She was a full-figured woman, beautiful even in her absolute misery. Her wet hair plastered to a face that looked heartbreakingly pale under the flickering street lamp. Dom had watched the brief physical altercation before the door slammed shut. He had seen the way Pendleton shoved her. A dark, violent fury ignited in Dom's chest. In his world, a world built on blood, loyalty, and rigid codes of honor, you did not lay a hand on a woman. And you certainly didn't leave her to freeze to death on a porch while you drank scotch with politicians. "He's a dead man," Dom said softly. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that made even Leo stiffen in the front seat. "Pendleton is a dead man. Do we move in now, Mr. Russo?" Leo asked, his hand drifting towards the Glock holster on his hip. "No," Dom replied, his eyes never leaving the shivering woman. She had sunk down onto the top step, pulling her knees to her chest, her bare arms turning a dangerous shade of blue. She was losing her battle against the cold. "The money can wait. The woman cannot." Dom reached for the silver handle of the car door. "Boss, you don't have an umbrella." Dom ignored his driver. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the freezing deluge. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, but he barely registered the icy water soaking through his expensive wool. His focus was on the woman huddled on the limestone steps. He crossed the empty street with long, purposeful strides, his expensive leather shoes splashing through the deep puddles. Penny was fading. The cold had seeped into her bones, making her extremities go numb. Her thoughts were turning sluggish, a dangerous sign of early hypothermia. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could just disappear. Then the relentless pounding of the rain against her skin suddenly stopped. Penny opened her eyes. The street lamp behind her cast a massive, intimidating shadow over her huddled form. She looked up, her heart giving a terrified jolt. Standing over her was a man holding a large black umbrella. He was tall, over 6'3", with broad shoulders that blocked out the violent wind. His face was a masterpiece of harsh, aristocratic angles. A strong jaw covered in dark stubble, a straight Roman nose, and eyes so dark they looked like polished obsidian. There was a raw, terrifying power radiating from him, an aura of absolute authority that made Penny's breath catch in her throat. For a second, she thought Arthur had sent someone to finish her off. She shrank back against the brick wall, pulling her soaked dress tighter around her legs. Domenico looked down at her. Up close, he saw the bruising on her arm where Pendleton had grabbed her. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, and underneath it, a profound, agonizing humiliation. It made him want to cross the threshold of the house and tear Pendleton apart with his bare hands. Instead, Dom moved slowly, deliberately, trying not to spook her. He knelt down on the wet stone, ignoring the ruin of his suit, bringing himself to her eye level. "You're freezing, Tesoro," Dom said, his voice surprisingly gentle. A deep rumble that somehow cut clearly through the storm. Penny couldn't stop her teeth from chattering. "I don't know you. Please." Without a word, Dom slipped off his heavy cashmere-lined suit jacket. He leaned forward and wrapped it securely around her trembling shoulders. The jacket was massive on her, radiating his intense body heat, and the faint, intoxicating scent of bergamot and danger. "My name is Domenico," he said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, demanding her focus to keep her conscious. "And the man inside that house is a fool. Come with me." "I can't," Penny stammered, clutching the lapels of his jacket. "I don't have my things. I don't have any money for a cab." "You don't need money," Dom replied smoothly. He stood up, keeping the umbrella perfectly positioned over her. He extended a large, scarred hand toward her. "I have a car waiting. It has heat. You are going to catch pneumonia if you stay here another minute." Penny looked from his extended hand to the locked mahogany door of the man who claimed to love her. Arthur had thrown her away like garbage. This dangerous, striking stranger was offering her a lifeline. Driven by survival and a sudden burning desire to never see Arthur Pendleton's face again, Penelope Hayes placed her cold, trembling hand into the warm, calloused palm of the Mafia boss. Dom's fingers closed around hers, strong and possessive. He pulled her gently to her feet, supporting her weight as her numb legs nearly gave out. "I've got you, Dom murmured, pulling her flush against his side to shield her from the wind. As he guided her down the steps and across the dark street towards the waiting Maybach, Domenico Russo looked back at the Pendleton house. The ledger didn't matter anymore. Arthur Pendleton had just handed over something far more valuable, and Dom had absolutely no intention of ever giving her back. The interior of the Maybach was an entirely different universe compared to the violent, freezing tempest ravaging the Gold Coast. As Leo smoothly accelerated away from the curb, leaving the Pendleton estate shrinking in the rearview mirror, Penelope collapsed against the plush, heated leather seats. The car was a cocoon of warmth, smelling of rich mahogany, expensive cologne, and the faint metallic tang of the storm outside. Dom slid in beside her, his large frame taking up a considerable amount of space in the back seat, yet he kept a respectful distance. He reached forward and tapped the partition. "Turn the heat up, Leo. Full blast, and head to the Gold Coast penthouse, the one off Lakeshore Drive." "Yes, Mr. Russo," Leo replied, his deep voice carrying a note of protective urgency. Penny pulled Dom's massive cashmere-lined jacket tighter around her shivering body. Her teeth were still chattering uncontrollably, making a sharp clicking sound in the quiet cabin. She felt completely disoriented, the adrenaline of the last 20 minutes crashing hard. She was acutely aware of her appearance. A soaked, heavy-set woman ruining the upholstery of a car that easily cost $500,000. "I'm ruining your seats," she stammered, her voice raspy. She tried to pull away from the leather, a conditioned response from years of Arthur telling her she was taking up too much space, being too clumsy, being too much. Dom shifted, his dark eyes instantly snapping to her pale face. He reached into a concealed compartment in the door and pulled out a thick, dry microfiber blanket. Without hesitation, he leaned over and wrapped it securely over his jacket, cocooning her entirely. "The car is a machine, Penelope. It can be replaced," Dom said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You, however, cannot. You are freezing. Stop apologizing for existing. The sheer intensity of his words hit her like a physical blow. Stop apologizing for existing. Arthur had spent 2 years making her feel like her presence was a burden, a conditional privilege granted only if she made herself as small and invisible as possible. This man, a stranger who looked capable of unspeakable violence, was treating her as if she were made of spun glass. Thank you. A rogue tear finally escaping and mixing with the rainwater on her cheek. Dom reached into his breast pocket and produced a pristine linen handkerchief. Gently, almost reverently, he wiped the moisture from her face. His knuckles, scarred and calloused, brushed against her soft cheek. He didn't pull away in disgust at her fullness. Instead, his gaze lingered, taking in the slope of her jaw and the vulnerable curve of her lips. "What were you doing outside, Penelope?" Dom asked quietly. He already knew, but he needed to hear it from her. He needed to understand the depth of Pendleton's betrayal. Penny swallowed hard, the humiliation bubbling up again. "We were having dinner with Councilman Caldwell and his wife. They made a joke about my weight, about my lack of discipline." She paused, taking a shaky breath. Arthur agreed with them. He told them that I was a mess, that he only tolerated me because my trust fund bought the house. When I tried to leave, he shoved me out the door and threw the deadbolt. A terrifying silence filled the back of the Maybach. The air pressure seemed to drop. Dom's jaw locked so tightly that a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. His obsidian eyes turned cold, calculating and utterly lethal. If Arthur Pendleton had been in the car at that moment, Dom would have snapped his neck without a second thought. "He said your trust fund bought that estate?" Dom asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Yes, my father was Richard Hayes. He founded Hayes Logistics," Penny explained, the warmth of the car finally returning some feeling to her fingers. "When he passed, he left everything to me. Arthur manages the accounts. He said I wasn't emotionally stable enough to handle the finances." Dom's mind raced, connecting the dots with the cold precision of a Mafia don. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just laundering money for the Russo syndicate. He was actively draining Penelope's inheritance to cover his tracks and fund his lavish lifestyle. The ledgers Dom had been reviewing earlier that day suddenly made perfect sense. Pendleton was a parasite feeding off the wealth of a woman he emotionally abused to keep compliant. "Penelope," Dom said, shifting closer, ensuring he had her full attention, "you need to listen to me very carefully. Arthur Pendleton is not a financial genius. He's a desperate man who has made very dangerous enemies. And tomorrow morning, when he realizes you are gone, he is going to panic. Not because he loves you, but because he needs your signature to keep stealing your money." Penny stared at him, her eyes wide. "How do you know that?" "Because," Dom replied, the street lights illuminating the harsh, beautiful angles of his face, "I am one of those dangerous enemies." Before Penny could process the gravity of his confession, the Maybach pulled into the secure underground garage of a sleek, ultra-luxury high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan. The heavy steel gates closed behind them, shutting out the storm and the rest of the world. Leo opened the door, and Dom stepped out first, immediately turning to offer Penny his hand. Her legs were still weak from the cold, and as she stepped out, her soaked heels slipped on the polished concrete. She let out a small gasp as she pitched forward. Dom caught her effortlessly, his strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her heavy, soft curves against his solid, muscular frame. He didn't buckle. He didn't strain. He held her securely, his hands resting on her hips with a possessive strength that sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. "I have you," he murmured against her ear, his breath warm. He didn't let her walk. Ignoring her weak protests, Dom scooped her up into his arms, carrying her towards the private elevator, as if she weighed nothing at all. For the first time in her life, Penelope Hayes didn't feel too big, too heavy, or too much. In the arms of Domenico Russo, she felt exactly right. Morning broke over Chicago, the violent storm having passed, leaving behind a brilliant, blindingly clear sky. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Domenico's penthouse, illuminating the sprawling space adorned with imported Italian marble and dark walnut accents. Penelope woke up in a massive, king-sized bed covered in charcoal grey silk sheets. For a moment, she was entirely disoriented. The mattress was incredibly soft, smelling faintly of the same intoxicating bergamot and cedarwood that had enveloped her the night before. Then the memories of the storm, the betrayal, and the dark-eyed stranger crashed into her mind. She sat up, pulling the thick duvet to her chest. She was no longer wearing the soaked, freezing emerald gown. Someone, presumably a female housekeeper, though the thought of Don carefully dressing her made her cheeks burn, had changed her into a set of plush, oversized cashmere pajamas. A gentle knock at the heavy oak door startled her. "Come in," she called out, her voice raspy. The door opened, and a petite, older woman with a kind face walked in, pushing a silver cart laden with a lavish breakfast. "Good morning, Miss Hayes. I am Maria. Mr. Russo asked me to ensure you had everything you needed upon waking." "Thank you, Maria," Penny said, overwhelmed by the spread of fresh fruit, warm pastries, and steaming coffee. "Where is Mr. Russo?" "He's in his study, conducting business," Maria replied, pouring a cup of coffee. "He also had a wardrobe brought up for you. It is in the dressing room. He took the liberty of guessing your sizes based on your measurements." Maria smiled warmly, a stark contrast to the judgmental glares Penny usually received from Arthur's staff. Once Maria left, Penny slid out of bed. She walked into the expansive walk-in closet and stopped dead in her tracks. Hung neatly on cedar hangers was an entire wardrobe of high-end clothing, all specifically tailored for a plus-size figure. There were silk blouses, wide-leg wool trousers, luxurious wrap dresses from designers like Marina Rinaldi and Christian Dior, and even a pair of supple leather boots that perfectly accommodated wider calves. Tears pricked her eyes. Arthur had always refused to buy her clothes, claiming high fashion wasn't made for her type of body, forcing her to wear matronly, custom-made pieces that hid her shape rather than celebrated it. Dom, a man she had known for less than 12 hours, had just provided her with an arsenal of armor. She showered quickly in the opulent marble bathroom, letting the hot water wash away the lingering chill of the night before, and dressed in a deep burgundy wrap dress that hugged her curves perfectly, making her look both powerful and alluring. Taking a deep breath, Penny ventured out of the bedroom. The penthouse was silent, save for the faint sound of a muted television coming from a sprawling, open-concept living area. She followed the sound and froze. On the massive flat-screen TV, a local Chicago news anchor was speaking over a breaking news banner. Local financial advisor Arthur Pendleton has reported his fiancée, Penelope Hayes, heir to the Hayes logistics fortune, missing after last night's severe storm. Pendleton claims she wandered out of their Gold Coast home during a mental health episode. Police are currently dragging the harbor. He's establishing an alibi. A deep voice rumbled from behind her. Penny spun around. Dom was standing in the doorway of his study, dressed in dark trousers and a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms heavily inked with dark, intricate tattoos. He held a crystal glass of amber liquid, looking like a terrifying, fallen angel against the morning light. "A mental health episode?" Penny gasped, stepping towards the television. "He's trying to make me look crazy." "Why?" "Because," Dom said, walking into the room and muting the television with a remote. "If you are deemed mentally incompetent, or worse, if you are presumed dead, control of the Hayes Trust defaults entirely to him." Dom walked over to the glass coffee table and tossed down a thick manila folder. "I had my people pull the records this morning. Pendleton is broke, Penelope. He's been siphoning your trust to cover massive losses in the market. But worse than that, he took a loan from my organization, $3 million, and he used your estate as collateral without my knowledge." "Oh?" Penny's knees felt weak. She sank into a plush leather armchair, staring at the folder. "He used my house, my father's money to pay the Mafia." "He tried to," Dom corrected, his voice hardening. "But Arthur Pendleton is a dead man walking. He thought he could outsmart the syndicate, and he thought he could dispose of you when you became too much of a liability. Locking you out in that storm wasn't just a fit of rage, Tesoro. It was an attempted murder. Knew you wouldn't survive the night in that weather." The horror of the revelation washed over her, chilling her blood. Arthur hadn't just been cruel. He had been calculating. He wanted her to freeze. "What do I do?" Penny whispered, looking up at Dom. For the first time, she truly saw the danger in his eyes. But it wasn't directed at her. It was a violent, protective shield, drawn up entirely on her behalf. "You do nothing," Dom said, stepping closer and crouching down in front of her chair, just as he had on the wet pavement the night before. He reached out, his large hands resting on her knees, the heat of his palms seeping through the burgundy fabric of her dress. "You stay here. You eat. You rest. You let Maria pamper you." "And Arthur?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. A dark, terrifying smile curved Dom's lips. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Arthur is currently sitting in a police station, playing the grieving fiancé. Let him play his game. Let him think he has won." Dom stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the sunlit room. "Because tonight, I'm going to pay Mr. Pendleton a visit. And by the time I am finished with him, He will wish he had frozen to death on that porch. For the next 48 hours, the luxury penthouse overlooking Lakeshore Drive became Penelope's fortress, while the city outside mourned the tragic, mysterious disappearance of the Hayes logistics heiress. Penny was busy resurrecting herself from the ashes of her shattered self-esteem. Domenico had left her with a mountain of Arthur's financial ledgers, banking records, and encrypted offshore account details. Where a lesser person might have been overwhelmed, Penelope was entirely in her element. Before Arthur had ground her confidence into dust, she had graduated at the top of her class from the Booth School of Business. She understood corporate strategy and forensic accounting better than the man who claimed to manage her wealth. Sitting at the massive mahogany dining table, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue wrap dress that celebrated her full, voluptuous figure, Penny meticulously cross-referenced the files. What she found made her blood run cold. Arthur had been running a highly sophisticated shell game. He had diverted millions of dollars from the Hayes Trust into dummy corporations registered in the Cayman Islands. He had forged her signature on a massive line of credit from the First National Bank of Chicago. And most damning of all, he had used those stolen funds to invest in a series of disastrous commercial real estate ventures on Rush Street. When those failed, he had turned to Domenico Russo's organization to cover his margins. "He didn't just steal from me," Penny murmured to herself, tapping a gold pen against her lips. "He legally transferred the liability of his failures directly onto my name. A classic parasitic maneuver." A deep, rumbling voice noted from the entryway. Penny looked up. Domenico stood there, looking devastatingly handsome, in a bespoke charcoal three-piece suit. The sheer magnetism of the man never failed to send a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. He walked into the room, his dark eyes sweeping over the papers scattered across the table, and then settling heavily on her. There was a raw, unfiltered appreciation in his gaze that made Penny's breath hitch. He didn't look at her the way Arthur did, as if she were a problem to be solved or hidden. Dom looked at her as if she were a queen commanding her court. "I have eyes on Pendleton," Dom said, pouring himself a glass of San Pellegrino from the crystal pitcher on the sideboard. He spent the morning weeping for the cameras outside the Chicago Police Department's District 18 headquarters. He played the grieving, broken man flawlessly. Tonight, he is scheduled to attend the annual Gold Coast Philanthropy Gala at the Drake Hotel. He intends to use the sympathy of the city's elite to secure new investors before the bank calls in his fraudulent loans. Dom walked over and stood behind her chair. His large, warm hands settled on her bare shoulders, his thumbs gently stroking the sensitive skin at the base of her neck. "My men are in place, Penelope. We can intercept him on his way back to your estate tonight. He will disappear, and no one will ever find his body. The police will assume he fled due to grief. Smissen honmust." A shiver ran through Penny, partly from the terrifying casualness with which Dom ordered a man's death, and partly from the intoxicating heat radiating from his hands. But as she looked down at the financial documents, her father's legacy, the company he had built with his bare hands, a fierce, burning resolve ignited in her chest. "No," Penny said softly. Dom's hand stilled. "No?" Penny turned in her chair to face the most dangerous man in Chicago. She didn't shrink back. She met his dark, obsidian gaze with a new-found fire in her own eyes. If you kill him in the shadows, he dies a martyr, a tragic victim of circumstance. The city's elite will mourn him, and my father's company will still be tied up in the probate courts for years, while the banks tear it apart to recoup his fraudulent loans. He wins the narrative, Dom. I refuse to let him keep my narrative. Dom's lips curved into a slow, dangerously predatory smile. He leaned down, placing a hand on the table, bringing his face mere inches from hers. The scent of bergamot and power washed over her. Then tell me, Tesoro, what is it that you want to do? I want to ruin him, Penny said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. I want to take everything from him. His reputation, his clients, his freedom, and his pride. I want to walk into that gala at the Drake Hotel tonight and expose him in front of every single person he has ever tried to impress. I want him to look at the woman he called a pathetic fat mess and realize she is the one holding the blade to his throat. Domenico stared at her, his eyes darkening with a potent mixture of awe and raw desire. In his world, women were often sheltered, protected from the brutal realities of the life. But Penelope Hayes was no fragile flower. She was a hurricane gathering strength, ready to unleash devastation on the man who had wronged her. You want a public execution? Dom murmured, his voice thick with approval. A corporate and social execution, yes? Penny corrected, sliding a stack of highlighted documents toward him. I have the proof of his embezzlement, his forgery, and his wire fraud. But I need your help to make sure the right people see it tonight. The SEC, the FBI, and every major investor in that ballroom. Dom picked up the papers, briefly scanning her meticulous, brilliant work. He let out a low chuckle that vibrated in his chest. Arthur Pendleton thought he locked a liability out in the rain. He didn't realize he unleashed a goddamn queen. Dom straightened up, pulling his phone from his pocket. Leo, get the Maybach ready and call our contacts at the Tribune and the federal prosecutor's office. Tell them to send their best agents to the Drake Hotel tonight. He looked back down at Penny, his eyes gleaming with lethal anticipation. Wear the reds, Penelope. Tonight, we burn his world to the ground. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sea of crystal chandeliers, flowing champagne, and Chicago's most ruthless high society. The room was packed with politicians, hedge fund managers, and socialites, all dripping in diamonds and faux sympathy. At the center of the room, playing the tragic hero to absolute perfection, stood Arthur Pendleton. He was dressed in a stark black tuxedo, holding a glass of scotch, his expression perfectly calibrated to show a man battling unimaginable grief. Councilman Richard Caldwell patted his shoulder in a show of masculine solidarity. You have to stay strong, Arthur, Caldwell said solemnly. Penny was well. She struggled. Everyone knew she wasn't entirely stable. But you did everything you could for her. The police will find her body eventually. And you can finally have some closure. Thank you, Richard, Arthur replied, his voice breaking flawlessly. It's just so hard. But she would want me to carry on, to continue managing the Hayes legacy with the dignity she couldn't quite maintain. Arthur took a sip of his scotch to hide his smug smile. It was all going perfectly. With Penelope presumed dead, her trust fund would default to him as her primary beneficiary and executor. He would pay off the terrifying Russo syndicate by the end of the week, cover his fraudulent loans, and emerge as one of the wealthiest single men in the city. The fat, miserable weight around his neck was finally gone. Suddenly, the string quartet playing softly in the corner faltered to a screeching halt. A heavy, suffocating silence swept through the opulent ballroom, starting from the grand entrance and rolling through the crowd like a shockwave. Conversations died instantly. Champagne flutes paused in midair. The crowd parted, stepping back as if Moses himself were splitting the Red Sea. Arthur frowned, annoyed by the interruption. He turned toward the entrance, an elegant remark ready on his lips. But the words died instantly in his throat. His Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, shattering violently against the polished marble floor. Standing in the grand archway of the ballroom was Penelope Hayes. She did not look like the shivering, desperate woman he had locked out in the freezing rain. She looked like a goddess of vengeance. She was wearing a breathtaking, off-the-shoulder, ruby-red Valentino gown that hugged every single one of her plush, voluptuous curves with unapologetic confidence. Her hair was styled in sleek, dark waves cascading over one shoulder, and a diamond choker rested perfectly against her collarbone. She radiated power, wealth, and absolute authority, and she was not alone. Standing a half-step behind her, casting a massive, terrifying shadow over the room, was Domenico Russo. The Mafia boss wore a sharply tailored black suit, his lethal obsidian eyes sweeping the room, silently daring any man to step out of line. The sheer proximity of the city's most feared underworld figure standing beside the supposedly dead heiress sent a wave of absolute terror through the elite crowd. Penelope Councilman Caldwell gasped, his face turning an ashen grey. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The blood drained from his face. "Penny, you're alive." "But the police? The river? Did you really think a little rain would kill me, Arthur?" Penny's voice rang out, clear, cold, and amplified by the utter silence of the room. She walked forward slowly, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. The crowd shrank back, terrified of the woman, but even more terrified of the lethal predator walking behind her. "I don't understand," Arthur stammered, stepping backward, his carefully constructed facade crumbling into pure panic. He looked at Dom, realizing with horrific clarity that his worlds had collided in the worst possible way. "Mr. Russo, what are you doing with my fiancé?" "She is not your fiancé." Dom's voice rumbled through the room, laced with a violent promise. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer menace in his tone made several men in the room physically flinch. "And you will address her as Miss Hayes." Penny stopped 10 FT away from Arthur. She signaled to a man in a sharp grey suit standing near the entrance, an agent from the FBI's white-collar crime division, whom Dom had personally ensured received an anonymous tip just hours ago. "While you were busy in mourning my convenient disappearance, Arthur, I was busy auditing my own accounts," Penny said, her voice dripping with venom. She raised a flash drive in her hand. Did you really think you could forge my signature on $3 million worth of commercial real estate loans from First National, and I wouldn't notice? Or did you think transferring the funds to your shell accounts in the Cayman Islands would hide the fact that you bankrupt the Hayes Trust? The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. Councilman Caldwell backed away from Arthur, as if the man were suddenly contagious. "You're lying," Arthur shouted, panic making his voice shrill. "She's hysterical. She's having another episode. The SEC doesn't care much for hysteria, Arthur. They care about paper trails, which is why every single investor in this room, the federal prosecutor's office, and the Chicago Tribune just received a secure email containing the unredacted ledgers of your embezzlement." Penny took a step closer, her red dress flowing like liquid fire. "You thought my weight made me weak. You thought my kindness made me stupid. But you forgot one thing. I am Richard Hayes's daughter, and you are nothing but a thief." Two FBI agents stepped forward from the shadows of the ballroom, their badges flashing under the chandeliers. "Yes, Arthur Pendleton. You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny," the lead agent announced, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Arthur panicked. His eyes darted toward the exit, but the massive frame of Leo, Dom's enforcer, blocked the only way out. Desperate, humiliated, and backed into a corner, Arthur lunged toward Penny with a feral scream, his hands reaching for her throat. He didn't even make it 2 steps. Domenico moved with terrifying speed. He grabbed Arthur by the throat, lifting the grown man off the floor with one hand, cutting off his air supply instantly. Arthur gagged, his legs kicking uselessly in the air, his face turning purple under Dom's crushing grip. "Touch her," Dom whispered, his voice a lethal hiss that only Arthur and Penny could hear. "And I will peel the skin from your bones while you breathe." With a flick of his wrist, Dom threw Arthur to the marble floor like a piece of garbage. Arthur gasped for air, crawling pathetically into the waiting hands of the federal agents. As the handcuffs clicked around Arthur's wrists, effectively ending his life as a free man, Penelope looked down at him. There was no pity in her eyes, only the cold satisfaction of a woman who had finally realized her own worth. The days following the spectacular, devastating downfall at the Drake Hotel were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, frozen assets, and an absolute media frenzy. Arthur's arrest immediately made the front page of the Chicago Tribune and the Wall Street Journal. The sensational headline, "Gold Coast Heiress Returns from the Dead to Dismantle Fraudulent Fiancé," echoed across the country, securing his absolute ruin. He was swiftly denied bail by Judge Catherine O'Brien, a notoriously strict federal judge in the Northern District of Illinois, ensuring he would await his highly publicized trial from a cold, bleak cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Penny didn't just survive the scandal. She thrived in the very center of it. With Arthur permanently removed and his illicit operations exposed, she immediately seized full operational control of Hayes Logistics. For years, Arthur had convinced the executive board that Penny's weight was a physical manifestation of laziness and instability, a cruel, manipulative lie that kept her sidelined from her own birthright. But as she walked into the executive boardroom of the Aeon Center on a brisk Monday morning, wearing a sharply tailored, plum-colored Marina Rinaldi suit that commanded instant respect, she shattered every single misconception they held. She ruthlessly restructured the board of directors, terminating anyone who had been even mildly complicit in Arthur's financial shell game. She officially transferred her massive corporate accounts to Northern Trust, securing a team of actual, vetted fiduciary experts to untangle the remaining mess left behind in the Caymans. When the logistics union threatened to strike due to the previous administration's blatant negligence, Penny didn't send a team of lawyers to handle it. She went down to the shipping yards herself. She negotiated directly with the foreman, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Richard Hayes's daughter possessed the exact same iron will as her legendary father. She was brilliant, decisive, and entirely unapologetic about the physical space she occupied. She was a fat, powerful, and wealthy woman, and she refused to ever shrink herself for a man's fragile ego again. She embraced her body, treating herself to custom garments that highlighted her lush curves rather than hiding them in shame. But there was one man whose presence she never wanted to shrink from. A month after the gala, Penny stood on the expansive terrace of Domenico's Lakeshore Drive penthouse. The biting Chicago autumn had finally surrendered to the bitter chill of early winter, but she was kept perfectly warm by a heavy, luxurious mink coat that Dom had draped over her shoulders earlier that evening. They had plans later to dine at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse on Rush Street. A very public, very deliberate power move to show the city's elite that Penelope Hayes and Domenico Russo were a united, untouchable front. She looked out over the glittering infinite skyline, a crystal glass of vintage Barolo in her hand, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The heavy glass door slid open behind her, and Dom stepped out onto the terrace. He had just returned from a tense meeting with his underbosses, still wearing a menacingly sharp black suit. His silk tie loosened just enough to reveal the steady pulse beating at his throat. He looked dangerous, untamed, and utterly captivating. "I'd just received word from my contacts at the federal prosecutor's office," Dom said, his deep, gravelly voice wrapping around her like a warm embrace against the winter wind. He stepped up directly behind her, sliding his large, muscular arms around her waist and pulling her heavy, soft curves back against his solid chest. Pendleton took a plea deal. 20 years in federal prison, with no possibility of early parole. He surrendered all remaining hidden assets back to the Hayes Trust, in exchange for keeping the syndicate completely out of the courtroom. Penny leaned her head back against his broad shoulder, letting out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 2 long years. "It's really over. He can never hurt me or anyone else ever again." "He was a dead man the second I locked that door," Dom murmured, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the sensitive skin just beneath her ear, making her shiver. "But you were the one who buried him, Tesoro. You didn't need me to save you. You only needed someone to hand you the shovel." Penny turned in his arms, looking up into his dark, obsidian eyes. The raw, unfiltered intensity in his gaze still took her breath away. "You gave me far more than that, Dom. You gave me back my voice. You looked at me and saw a woman worth protecting, while the man who promised to love me only saw a liability." Dom's sharp jaw tightened. He reached up, his calloused thumb gently tracing the fullness of her lower lip, his touch reverent and deeply possessive. Pendleton was a blind, arrogant fool. He looked at a queen and only saw the gold on her crown. I look at you, Penelope, and I see the absolute center of my world. Tears pricked Penny's eyes, but this time they were tears of overwhelming, fierce joy. I'm not a traditional mafia wife, Domenico. I'm not quiet. I'm not thin. And I'm certainly not going to sit at home while you run this city. A low, rumbling laugh vibrated deep in Dom's chest. God forbid I ever try to cage a hurricane. I don't want a quiet wife, Penelope. I want a partner. A brilliant, stunning, ruthless woman who can command boardrooms by day and rule my empire by my side at night. Every beautiful curve of your body, every sharp edge of your mind, it all belongs to me. Just as my heart entirely belongs to you. I didn't give her a chance to reply. Dom lowered his head, capturing her lips in a deep, consuming kiss. It wasn't the tentative, apologetic kiss she was used to from her past. It was a brand, a promise of absolute devotion, fierce and unyielding. Penny kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. The sprawling city of Chicago buzzed beneath them, oblivious to the fact that its most feared crime boss had just been completely brought to his knees by the heiress he rescued from the rain. Together, they were an unstoppable force, a lethal collision of legitimate corporate power and terrifying underworld influence. Arthur Pendleton had locked her out in the cold to freeze, but all he had truly done was deliver her straight into the arms of the one man who would gladly set the whole world on fire just to keep her warm. Sinner? Sometimes the worst betrayal is exactly what you need to finally discover your true power. Penelope went from a ridiculed, abandoned fiancé to a ruthless, unstoppable queen, proving once and for all that self-worth isn't determined by a dress size, but by the fire in your soul. And finding a highly protective, devoted mafia boss certainly didn't hurt either. If you loved this story of vengeance, romance, and claiming your crown, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a good karma story, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling audio dramas and captivating romance tales every single week.